Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here to talk about historical fiction, bright and early in the morning, brighter for some of us than others, earlier for some of us than others. So I'm Carrie Callaghan. I am the author of two historical novels, Salt the Snow, most recently, and A Light of Her Own. And I'm going to ask all of my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll tell you what we're going to talk about today. So Lou, why don't you go next?
Good morning. My name is Louis Bayard, and I am a historical novelist. I've written, published 9 novels. The most recent was called Courting Mr. Lincoln. I also published a young adult historical called Lucky Strikes in the last, I guess, 3 years ago or something. And I live in Washington, D.C., 6 blocks from the Library of Congress, which has unfortunately been closed for the last few months too. But anyway, I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Katrina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Katrina Carrasco. I have a debut that came out in 2018 called The Best Bad Things, and I'm working on a new book now. I live in Seattle, Washington, so good morning from the West Coast. And I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Denny.
Hi, I'm Denny S. Bryce. I am a debut author. My first book, Wild Women in the Blues, will release in March of 2021. I am also a book critic for NPR Books, and I have fun doing other things that have to do with writing. And I just wanted to add that the Library of Congress, I'm in Washington, D.C. as well. Ask a Librarian is so helpful right now that the Congress is closed. I mean, they're just sitting there waiting for us to ask them questions.
All right. Yeah.
That's great. And that is a great lead into something we'll be talking about later, which is research. So we're here today to talk about historical fiction, and particularly the intersection between the past and the present in historical fiction. And we're so very grateful to 1455 and all the sponsors for having us here today. All of our books are available for sale at the Potter's House. So I think there may be a link somewhere around the administrative things that I don't have control over, but encourage you all to check out everyone's books at the Potter's House. But so let's go ahead and dive into talking about what is of contemporary interest in each of our novels. So Denny, why don't you start with you in your forthcoming What's of Contemporary Interest? Oh, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
You're muted.
You're muted, Denny.
Crazy wild muting. I'll try not to forget when I do that. One of the things that is contemporary, if you will, would be the music. My story takes place in 1925 Chicago as well as 2015 Chicago. It's a dual storyline. And music plays an intricate part of the story because of, well, the jazz age. And the story takes place in Chicago in both timelines, but in 1925 in an area called the Black Belt, Bronzeville. And one of the historical figures in the book, or two of the historical figures, is Louis Armstrong, and as well as his wife, Lil Hardin Armstrong. And in the 2015 timeline, one of my characters is a singer at a blues club or a jazz joint, if you will. Actually, one I used to work at that is no longer in Chicago, called Wise Fool's Pub on Lincoln Avenue. And so music is very central to the story. And I feel that that's definitely something that has a contemporary opportunity, even though jazz is not in the forefront the way it used to be to many folks, because they don't listen to it as much as they should, but maybe I can help bring it back.
Yeah, there is something universal about music, right? That it helps bridge, well, people in different places and people in different times.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Katrina, what do you think contemporary readers most resonate with in your books? What's contemporary? I
think for The Best Bad Things, a lot of the stuff I was playing with that intrigues me today is gender performance, specifically in a queer context. The main character in that book kind of moves between male and female presentations in different ways. And I thought that was really fascinating in terms of how we perform and construct gender today. The book I'm working on now kind of picks up some of those same themes, but gets more into queer communities. And I think it's been really interesting thinking about the queer communities that we have today, and kind of reimagining what they might have looked like in the past. So contemporary interest, I think, gets into that because I don't want us to lose our queer history. And I think there's just a big push right now to bring more voices into the forefront of authors telling their own stories. And I'm very excited to be doing a project where I get to kind of reimagine my own queer past. So.
Yeah, that's great. There's definitely an aspect of uncovering history that has been marginalized in a lot of really good historical fiction. Lou, what about you?
I was going to climb on top of the queer history angle because I'm looking at Abraham Lincoln and his closest friend, Joshua Speed, in the light of kind of things that we've learned about them over the past 20, 25 years. Historians have always known how close the two men were, but it's only the last couple of decades that historians have really started to just discuss what was the nature of that intimacy. Were they lovers? Were they, why were they so late to get married? Why did they seem to keep each other from getting married? So there are all these complications that I thought we're never going to find some letter in a floorboard. So it's the kind of thing a novelist can do is imagine his way into this world. The other angle is a contemporary take, or I consider a contemporary take on Mary Todd, who was one of the most vilified of all our first ladies, and gets in this book, I think, a pretty sympathetic rehearing. Her history was told by her enemies to a large degree, and that was the narrative we still receive as a culture, was that she was difficult and mad and spendthrift, and she was so much more. So one of the pleasures of writing Courting Mr. Lincoln is getting to imagine the kind of intoxicating creature that she must have been at the age in her early 20s.
Yeah, I think even as someone who considers herself a pretty big feminist, when I read your book, I realized I had all of these sort of baseline underlying assumptions about Mary Todd.
Oh, yeah.
This sort of lingering resentment that I had towards her that your book caused me to reinterrogate and to question. And now I'm glad
to hear that.
Yeah.
And let's be, America has always had difficulty with ambitious women, and that hasn't gone away. So, I mean, and she was certainly a victim of that too, as well as her own demons. So, but I'm glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, and that's something that every time it happens to me, I feel like, good Lord, Carrie, you ought to know better, because it's what I went through in writing my own book in some ways, and sort of looking back at women of history and, well, both of my books, and trying to be a little bit more sympathetic towards them in a light of her own, writing about a woman who was, she was the only woman to attain master status in the 17th century Harlem Painters Guild. And so she was very ambitious and stood out a little bit from other women of her time. But the interesting thing was, actually, when I did the research, she wasn't quite as unusual as I thought. There were many women who were independent, who ran businesses, who had obviously ambitions of their own. And when we sit back and think about it as humans, those observations are obvious, and yet somehow there's this filtering process in history that I think can somehow cause us to treat people from the past as if they were a different species. Mm-hmm. And perhaps we'll never know, maybe they really were a different species, but I think that's part of the mission of historical fiction, is to translate the past in a way that makes sense for contemporary readers, and also to understand our contemporary world through the lens of the past, by looking at ambitious women or queer women or musicians of the past, we can understand a little bit more about how people are living today. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, who better than historical novelists to tell those untold stories? Because in many cases they weren't told at the time. Nobody was telling this. So it seems to be a unique privilege of doing what we all do, that we can imagine our way into these kind of lost worlds.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So why is it exactly that we need the fictional part of the historical fiction? Why not just write history if we're talking about these stories? Denny?
Well, I think one of the key reasons I don't write history is because I'm not a historian.
Details.
Oh, yeah.
But you could be if you wanted to.
I'm a history geek. That's the best way to describe my passion for the past. And that also stems from my family. My maternal grandmother came to this country in 1923 from Montego Bay, Jamaica. That's why we have the island in the back on the beach.
Beautiful.
But I really, there's also so many subgenres in history that I find different folks gravitate toward that. So I don't write biographical fiction. I write probably, I call it more, I guess some people call it mainstream or commercial. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but I take a moment in history and I take characters and I'm building a complete fantasy, a fictionalized account of key characters, because most of my stories are going to be very much about the human aspect of the changes and challenges that these characters go through. But I want to talk and explore characters or presenting characters from the past, and I focus primarily on American history, 20th century American history. Going back any further is definitely a lot of time, and bless you all who do it, but you know, I got to have something I can hang on to. Plus I want to tell stories about African American protagonists and antagonists and lifestyles that aren't necessarily, the stories aren't necessarily rooted in you know, the strifes of civil wars and things of that, but they tell a true story about what people faced during that time. And that's also something that showcases how much hasn't changed or has changed for that reader. If you look at a 1925 story and your assumptions are X, Y, and Z, and then you see the comparison to what's happening in 2020, and it's not that different. So that's another story I want to put forth as well.
Katrina, what about you?
I think for me, I have a lot of the same reasons that Denny does, in terms of there's a time and place that I find interesting that I want to sort of bring life to, but I might just get like a small window and then kind of expand from there. And I think that the other part of my answer is not very dignified, but it's just really fun. Like, if you don't have to have facts and research as much, I do a ton of research before starting. So I have a really rich foundation from which I can draw, because I like to have a place that I really can get into and maybe even visit. Obviously in contemporary times, I don't have a time machine, but a place I can go to and get a sense of. Maybe some people in that area who I know were influencing kind of like the social and political times. But then I just want to have that springboard of information and let my imagination just do what it's going to do. Then when I come back with a draft, I like to fact check anything that I'm referencing. But I just enjoy the process of writing, knowing that I can kind of do whatever I want. And if it goes past the bounds of believability, I will pull it back, but I don't want to have to think about that when I'm in the drafting process.
There really is a magic. There is a magic to narrative, right? Like that, yeah. As novelists, we are able to cast a spell that some very talented narrative nonfiction writers do, but I think that they are probably more limited in their selection of topic. Whereas we can find a topic that maybe doesn't have the historical documentation that would facilitate that kind of narrative nonfiction, and we can use that fictional magic to create a narrative that really draws people in, and does create almost that time machine. Hopefully, it's all imagined, so we don't know if it's real, but that brings people back to the past, and for me at least, that's what fiction adds to this, that we can research and come up with a whole bunch of facts, and I could write down a bunch of index cards and show everybody a bunch of index cards. That's not interesting. What's interesting is creating a story where somebody faces challenges and they respond to those challenges and they evolve. And sometimes that even means changing the historical record a little bit too. If you are thinking about how someone might be responding to historical challenges and changing in a way that maybe real humans didn't exactly change. And I'm thinking specifically of my novels the Snow, which is very closely based on a real journalist, Millie Bennett, who was in Moscow in the 1930s. I have tons of her letters, thousands. And so a lot of information about her and the challenges that she faced. And she did grow over the course of her time. You know, she was very lonely at first in Moscow, and then she falls in love with a young man who turns out to be not exactly as she thought, and then he is arrested by the secret police. And so there are a lot of challenges to their relationship, and she does grow as a result. But I nudged it a little bit more. You know, I turned up the dial on her internal transformation, which is something you can do in fiction, to tell a story and to make a point.
I always say that at some point in the process, I do a lot of research too, but there's a point where I, in effect, throw the research away. And I find when I go through my editing of that first draft, what I'm often taking out is the research, because it's sort of like the gold star syndrome. It's like, I learned all this stuff and you're all going to hear it. See how diligent I've been. And often one detail can take the place of 10, you know. And for me, it always comes back to the story and just what Denny and Katrina were saying is that there's this, and there's this narrative that has to come out. I mean, history can tell us so much, but only so much. And it's where the record falls silent that I think we get to go in and conjure these worlds. It's fun. It is fun.
And filling in the voices. I find that is so exciting to take that fictionalized character and with all of the research that has been done and still putting that voice and sharing that voice that you feel that you've sort of absorbed from everything that you've done to prepare to write the work. One of the things that I did, because voice and pitch is so important. I used to sing. I wasn't a good singer, but I used to sing. So I have to always add that in case anybody asks. But I listened to all of the albums that I could from that time period of blues singers from the early 20s. And thankfully there are recordings from that time. And between the lyrics and the sound of their voices, being able to put yourself into that time. And then that's when sometimes the history does go away, but it's part of how you hear the characters, and sound is important to me.
Yeah,
that's an interesting comment, Denny. I just was thinking for my book, I think my access point to a lot of it was the body, the physical body. And in my first book, the main character is an ex-detective who then ends up working for an opium smuggling ring, and there's lots of intrigue and lots of fighting and other fun stuff happening. So I actually took boxing lessons so I would know what my character was doing.
Wow.
And that was my like transport into that older body, and that older time was just the physical sensation of what that might be like to be in these like street brawl sort of like smoky den sort of things. And that was a really interesting way to take my contemporary self and use a piece of that as in listening to sound of how do I reimagine what a body was feeling in 1887 or what a body was hearing in 1925. So it's a cool way of taking ourselves back as authors, I think.
Yes, that's lovely. That's fun.
And that explains, Katrina, why your fight scenes are so awesome. I had no idea that you'd actually taken boxing classes, but now it makes so much sense. It was really fun.
I did it for about a year because I enjoyed it a lot. So
wow.
Self-defense and research in one.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, the imagination is incredibly powerful. And I think even the imagination of a historical novelist can often help the processing of history. And one example that comes to mind is Hilary Mantel and her work on Thomas Cromwell. She, as many of you probably know, she wrote this series, the Wolf Hall trilogy, that reimagined Thomas Cromwell as much less of a villain than popular history had conceived of him, much like Lou did with Mary Todd in some ways. And that actually was sort of a little bit ahead of the vanguard of historians who now are rewriting the record on Thomas Cromwell and reimagining him as, maybe being less of a total villain and having some positive aspects. And if I could tell just a quick story about my own research, which I didn't change the historical record in any way, but just to show how powerful the imagination can be in light of her own. which is about Judith Leister, the painter, I had to write the scene where she applies for master status in the Harlem Artists Guild. And in order to do that, you have to present a masterpiece. And historians didn't know what her masterpiece was, but I still had to write the scene. So I had to guess what painting of hers she would present. And so I looked at the time, the existing oeuvre that we knew was attributed to her. Since then, we found even more paintings that she's done. But so of these like 16 or so paintings, I had to guess. And I thought, well, this is a really bold woman. So, so I think she used her self-portrait, and it's on the cover a little bit. So I just want to show you the portrait. She's got her mouth open, like she's speaking. It's a really bold portrait. She's got this really fancy clothing on, even though she's standing in front of a canvas where she's painting. So she's showing, I have a woman of substance. I have something to say. And I thought, you know what, this woman, she would give that panel of men this really ballsy self-portrait of herself.
Yeah.
And so I wrote it. And then like 6 months later, I was talking to a historian. She said, hey, Carrie, you know, we figured out what portrait or what painting Judith Leister used for her masterpiece. It was her self-portrait. And so, you know, I was able to imagine that by understanding her. And I think that's some of the magic that all of us have with our imaginations.
Yes.
I will say, though, that that's the trouble that some people have with historical fiction. I got a question at the National Book Festival a couple of years ago. This guy who says he hates historical fiction because he never knows from minute to minute, from line to line, okay, what really happened? What didn't happen? What are you making up? And my response was that history itself is a fiction. History itself is a story that we tell. We select facts that agree with our story. No two historians agree on the same set of facts. So it's just part of the continuum of how we look at the past.
That's wonderful. I feel like
I'm going to borrow it, by the way.
Yeah, we all ought to be evangelists for that.
Yeah.
Because so many, and since this is a writing conference, I want to talk to the research process a little bit for some of our participants. So many people, I think, can get really caught up in trying to treat history as if it were this static, unmovable thing, and they have to somehow represent it perfectly. When actually it's quite open to interpretation.
It's constantly being rewritten and reinterpreted all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a question here that is sort of in that vein. Aisha is asking, how do you do enough research to write a well-written novel while still maintaining interest in a writing project? Is there such a thing as too much research, and where are the lines blurred between writing a historical-based text and historical fiction?
I'm going to jump in because I had some good advice and also my experiences in writing right now. But I remember talking to an author, and for the life of me, I can't remember her name right now, but she said, I write my story and then I go do the research. I know what time period I'm in. Well, and she's, again, not writing biographical fiction. She's writing, her main characters will be fictionalized characters. So she knows when she wants their story to take place. But sometimes what happens with historical fiction is that you want to get the things right. And I'm emphasizing the things right. And that can weigh you down as you write a story. What I do, my process, however, is to dive into the time period and the atmosphere of the time period, and also the politics. That's important to me, the politics of the time period, so that I have a sense of what does the world around my characters feel like? What is it doing? What's going on? One of the things about doing 20th century American history is newspapers. And one of the things that was so vibrant during the early 20th century in particular was the Black press in America. There were some fabulous newspapers, Chicago Defender. Every major market had a Black newspaper, and most, if not all of those newspapers still have a place where I can rifle through files. So that's sort of exciting. And I've had every career in the book, but I used to be a reporter, and one of those things in digging for facts back when that was important, I used to do. So that's what I find very exciting. That's what keeps the story alive to me, is that combination of going after the atmosphere and of the time period.
I would just add that I love the idea of write the story first, and because I find when I'm writing a book that the story, it tells me what I still need to know, and it's often considerable. But what I also realize is I'm never going to become an expert on anything. I feel like I learned just enough to walk around in this world and conjure a story up out of it, but I'm never an expert. And people try to, a real historian, right? A real historian for a conversation. I feel like I'm sorry, I stopped there. I don't know what happens to Lincoln after he's after the age of 32. I have no idea what happens to him. So.
I have a similar thing to Lou, I think, where I learn enough. I like to do the research first and then jump off of it. And I do come back and check, but I do very pinpointed research. So I get people asking me like, what happened here 5 years later? And I'll say, I just have no idea, because I'm having to know. So, because my character won't go forward. But I'm doing something interesting for my current project, going off of what Denny said, where I'm using small pieces of news articles to inform the text. One of the new characters is a reporter, so it would be it's tied to his character and what he's doing. And I'm purposefully not looking for a lot of those pieces while I'm drafting the first draft. And I anticipate that some of them will change parts of the story, but I want to have what I know is going on first, and then use those pieces that I find to either inform it, maybe make changes if I have to. But really, I was looking at it as a way to add some interesting texture to the time of what's happening, not just in this little town, but also in the state they're in our country, around the world, because all the newspapers at that time were just starting. This is in the 1880s, and they were sharing things over news wires from overseas. So I think it's a cool way to show kind of how far-reaching news could be when newspaper business was just kind of getting to its peak. And that's a way that outer world will inform, but I don't want to know that yet, because I don't want it to make choices for me where I could be different choices in the story.
That's interesting. Dos Passos used that technique a lot in the USA trilogy, a lot of collage of newspaper clippings and stuff like that. It's really great.
Unfortunately, I can't go to the library right now because it's closed for quarantine, so that just paused anyway, happily. But
just as a quick,
because I do an entire outline, but I may write the first two chapters of a book, but I need to know where I'm going. So I write the end. I know where. I know how.
I know my ending, but I don't know how to get there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's 5 years in the making.
That's
for me. It's like, oh yeah, that's no problem.
So as a point of comparison, I do a ton of research ahead of time. I think I'm maybe just not smart enough to be able to figure out what the story is before I've just filled the bucket with all sorts of irrelevant and extraneous things. And once I have that, then I can kind of sift through it and figure out, okay, well, what's of interest here and where's the story? And it's interesting, I feel like whenever I'm doing the research, I go through the same process of first being completely enthralled with it. It's like having a crush.
Yeah.
First, I'm completely enthralled with it, and then I'm completely disenchanted with it because this is terrible and it would never be interesting. And I realize that's the point of the research, when I think I've really immersed myself in the past so much that I've sort of lost a feeling for what's of interest for contemporary readers. I'm so caught in the details of 1936 Spanish politics and which party versus which party, and nobody cares about that. And then once I'm able to kind of push through it, then I feel this like increasing sense of confidence and interest that, okay, maybe I can, now I know this well enough that what I can do is select the historical elements that I think are going to make an interesting story. And, so then to Aisha's question, how do you maintain your interest? Well, sometimes it's just brute force.
Book contract.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
So this is a fun question. Pamela asks if we ever worry about being sued by families related to your characters because you did not ask for permission, or because you changed the truth in your story. Oh no, the recording stopped. Well, we'll keep talking. Okay. So is anybody worried about getting sued?
Actually, that's why you write about dead people, so they can't sue. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned 20th century American history as sort of my playground. And the challenge there is well, fictionalized characters help. Most of the characters that I referenced in 1968, however, are dead in 1968. But in 1920, in another book I'm working on, that's another project altogether, I'm actually reaching out to the foundation because, and I'm not saying any names right now because of the question, and I need to see who's still alive. From this historical figure who is near history, you know? So, and you do have to have what I've been reading up on it, and what I learned is that so long as you don't defame or say something negative or put that character, that person in a position that is really counter to who and what they are, you should be fine, is what I've read so far. But I'll probably have a lawyer read it if it's sold.
Yeah.
I will.
I'm actually working on a book about Jack and Jackie Kennedy, who are, of course, both long gone. So it's less a question for me of being sued, because as you were saying, I don't think that's an issue for most fiction. There's the disclaimer in front about all resemblance to, it's bullshit, but all resemblance to people living or dead is. But it's more an issue of there are people still alive, Kennedy is still alive, who would remember who knew these characters, and that's a weird feeling. It's the first time I've encountered that, knowing that there are people alive who knew these characters I'm writing about, and that's a little weird, I have to say. It makes me think in terms of ethics, right? Which is something I never worry about.
My books are, well, the first one is set in 1887, so it's a long, long time ago. But just to be safe, and also because I take a lot of liberties and I kind of start with that foundation and then leapfrog off to wherever else I'm going to go, I've changed people's names. So if I did find someone in the town who was like a prominent judge, well, now that judge has a different name. So just in case, people could look up and see like, oh, there was this person who was sort of like this character, but the name is different and the details might be very different. So, and I don't have any issue with doing that because it allows me to, you know, take my imagination, go where I'm going to go. And then if I did put this person in the terrible role of some sort of villain or smuggler or something that their families may hate, then it doesn't matter because it's not the same name. So it works.
I've mostly used real names, partly because, well, the 17th century book, I mean, that's so long ago, it doesn't matter. But the 20th century stuff, I've also used real names. And part of it's, maybe it's a little bit reckless. I don't know. I just want to say, like, this is what I found. Hope you like it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, nobody's gotten me in trouble so far. But I think that the more serious answer is that as a writer, if you are doing your job in treating humanity seriously and you're investigating the humanity of your characters with an open heart, you know, hopefully at least you can feel like everything you have put down on paper is justifiable or at least well-intentioned. And that goes with even your villains. I think the most interesting villains also ought to be explored with a sense of heart and humanity. And, you know, if you've done that, then that's all right. But I think the legal answer also is that lawsuits against fictional portrayals are very seldom successful.
Very rare, yeah.
Most publishers would shut that down pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we've got a question for Denny. What drew you to Louis Armstrong out of all the jazz greats, and did you consider other musicians or artists of that era for your main characters?
Louis Armstrong, first, is not a main character, but he is a part of the Chicago jazz scene story for the 20s. And in researching the early days of jazz originating back in Storyville in New Orleans, which is the place where Louis Armstrong was born, and his role with Lil Hardin Armstrong, who was a Chicago band leader and pianist, and ended up being very much in the forefront of making his career. I mean, when they opened at a club in Chicago, she was the one who insisted that his promotion, he be presented as the world's greatest trumpet player. Mm-hmm. And so Louis Armstrong is definitely someone who fits the Chicago of 1925. My main character in the book, however, is a chorus girl. And so she performed at and had a interaction with Lil Armstrong, at the time Lil Hardin. So that's why he is a part of the story, but the story also includes a man named Oscar Michaud, who was a legendary Black filmmaker, one of the earliest Black filmmakers, and everything from Jelly Roll Morton. There were there are just a litany of artists, early jazz people that could be in the book, but the book is not about them. They are part of the fabric, the backstory, the background, and the atmosphere of the story. The lead, if you will, are two young people, one from 1925 and another from 2015.
I think I'd like to expand that question to everybody. Why did you choose your protagonists? And what about this particular story, or at least in the most recent book that you published, what about that story really called to you?
Well, for me, it comes back to a mystery. I'm a recovering mystery writer. And for me, it comes back to that there's a mystery that I want to solve. It's not necessarily a murder mystery. It's the mystery of where Abraham Lincoln's heart lies, or what happened to Teddy Roosevelt when he went, and this real life journey through the Amazon jungle. What happened there? So yeah, there's this puzzle that I want to solve, and that's what makes it exciting for me, is just trying to get to the root of something.
I found my main character for The Best Bad Things through a lot of different research. Since moving to the Pacific Northwest, I've been interested in our local history, so I was reading up a lot of that, and I have this amazing book that's about crime in coastal ports, especially in the 1880s, and a lot of it's on the West Coast. And through little tidbits, I started to find that there had been an opium smuggling ring up here in the Puget Sound area and in Canada. And I found some other tidbits as well about the Pinkerton Agency, the detective agency, briefly having a women's bureau. And so I started, and that was also abruptly disbanded because the sons took over from the dad and were like, oh, women can't do this work, and they just sent them all away. So then I thought, okay, well, here's these highly trained female detectives with no work, and now they're kind of mad at authority, what would they do? And those combination of things had me think about, well, what if I took one of these detectives, ex-detectives, put her in the Pacific Northwest, had her associated with the smuggling stuff, maybe she's gone to the other side of the law sort of thing, and came up with kind of the sketch of my main character. Her name is Alma Rosales, and I also wanted to have a character in that time period in the American West who was Latinx and queer, both of which ways I identify as well. And we don't get to see those kind of histories. We don't see that in like the typical Wild West. There were lots of people of color. There were lots of queer people, always been here. And I really wanted to take this character and see what she could do in this time where we haven't gotten to see that kind of story before. So she evolved out of many things, but then became the perfect person for the story I wanted to tell.
That's a great answer.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, for the two real life women that I've written about, it was similar to what Lou said. I just wanted to know more. For the case of Judith Leister, I found her in the National Gallery of Art. I also live in the DC area and walked into the National Gallery of Art one day, and they were having an exhibit of paintings painted by a woman in the 17th century. And I wanted to know, wait, how did she do this? How did she run a business successfully at the time of Rembrandt? You don't think of women doing that. So I wrote the story of kind of how she got herself set up as an answer to my own curiosity. but also as an answer to some of the questions I was grappling with in my personal life about how much ambition is a woman allowed to have, and how much sacrifice we expect of one another in our interpersonal relationships, and how much is too much. You know, maybe is there a point at which you are pursuing a goal so single-mindedly that you forget to take care of some of the people in your life, or maybe the people in your life are asking too much of you. And so I wanted to explore that tension in the novel. And then with Salt the Snow, similarly was very interested in this woman who went to Moscow in the 1930s, which was a time when Americans were, a lot of Americans, at least on the left, were really disenchanted with, this is going to sound familiar, with capitalism in the United States, because the economy was falling apart. It was the Great Depression, and it was really clear that something wasn't working. And so they wanted to know, well, is this new thing of communism in the Soviet Union going to work? It looked like maybe it was improving. The famines of the late 20s had receded at least a little bit. Some of the industrialization was kicking off. And so people were legitimately asking a question of, is this a new way of life? Of course, we know the answer in a way that they don't, which is a challenge as a writer to try to keep that fresh reader. But I wanted to see what it felt like for someone to be asking those questions at that time. We have another question from Aisha. She's filled with awesome questions.
Yay.
Yeah. She said, what is digging into a little bit more of why historical fiction writers write novels. Is it a fascination with storytelling coupled with a love for history or particular period? Or is it a way of expressing how you wish history could have gone? And I like that second part of the question. Is there a little bit of willful manipulation on novelists' part? So how do you approach that?
I'm going to jump in, and that's a great question, because the second part of it, I don't think it's wishful from my perspective, because the history is the history, the time period, the limitations of life, or the opportunities for life, especially for African Americans during the 20s, is what it was. So I'm not writing historical fantasy, or which is another subgenre of historical fiction. So those things I'm not going to change. For my main character, who is a chorus girl in 1925, she is faced with obstacle after obstacle, but I am really looking to present her ingenuity, her the way she deals with her challenges, and how she stays focused on her main goal despite the disruptions, the twists and turns that may be, that have to do with personal relationships, that have to do with politics, that have to do with the time. She's in Chicago in the 1920s. There are some challenges there that, and she's a nightclub performer. So, you know, so I love messing in that playground, but I don't change those elements that make that time period what it is. But I may write a fantasy and do something.
I know. It's
right?
Yeah. There is a place for, there is a place for alternative history, I was going to say.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like The Plot Against America, it usually goes in a more dystopian direction, like what if Hitler had won the war, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I agree with Denny. I feel obliged to respect the historical reality that I'm in. I can't invent an outcome that couldn't have actually happened. And because I grew so attached to Mary Todd over the course of writing this book, I found myself wishing for a better afterlife than she enjoyed. It's like, oh my gosh, it's so sad. But I felt, no, that's the one she's got. So yeah.
But I think there is a little bit of, at least on my part, and I think maybe your else too, a little bit of hopeful change, not in the historical record, but in how it's understood, right? That we are hoping to change, maybe not what happened, but how people understand what happened.
Yeah, I like that. I like that distinction.
I think that goes back to representation as well. I mean, something I was thinking about with this question is, I think in a lot of ways, people might find my main character in The Best Bad Things unbelievable, because she does sort of move between female and male presentations. She's quite physically strong. She's a character we don't normally see. But again, that's going off of what we normally see, which we've just been talking about. History is a construct. History is based on the person who's telling it to us. So who knows, everything that's been obscured in our own, trusted historical record, I say with lots of qualifications.
Yeah.
For Alma's character, I did a lot of research to make sure she was plausible. Like, there were strong women at that time. Weightlifting and strongmen and strong women were becoming sort of moving from circuses and being more of a sport. So there were women who were gymnasts and athletes who were quite physically strong, who would have been able to do feats of strength. And then there were also, again, going back to the queer communities, there were many queer people everywhere, as there are today. And it wouldn't have been unusual for there to be clusters of people finding each other and making community. So I think it's not wishful thinking. It's just, I did make sure that the things I was writing were plausible. And it might not be things that we've seen a lot of before, but that doesn't mean that they didn't exist just because we don't have records of different people and events.
And I'd like to jump in with extending on Katrina's plausibility in publishing, in literature. There's been over the decades, because there have not been marginalized voices and stories being told, there are some readers who will actually look at a story and question plausibility because of their narrow perspective. And that's why I feel it's so important and so exciting that more stories by diverse authors are getting an opportunity to be told, and more so than told. They're hopefully publishers and indie publishers and readers, because we also have to initiate readers who have been fed the same storyline for decades and decades and decades. Back to something Lou said about how, with Mary Todd, all you heard, all you knew was this perspective that they allowed to be told. And that's why so many women authors, I think, are getting involved in publishing, because women, a woman's story, an African-American woman's story, a queer woman's story, all of these stories have been quote unquote told from someone else's perspective, which usually means let's ignore them. So I'm plausibility and change and getting more stories out there, different types of stories that deal with different types of people, and diversity is critical to changing, I feel, the mindset of readers and hopefully buyers as well.
Absolutely, that's a great answer, Denny.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I think it's an important issue to get into. Say you're a new writer and you're interested in writing a story about, a marginalized perspective that's not your own. Let's talk about that a little bit. What are some of the pitfalls there that writers ought to be aware of? Do you all have any thoughts on that?
I have thoughts, but I don't know if this is the platform.
Just one or two thoughts.
Right in.
Come on, let us hear it.
I think that, honestly, I think this time for telling stories of diverse main characters should be written by diverse authors. I think that if you are going to look at a story that needs to be told and you're looking at a diverse community, do your research and your homework, and hopefully you're not going to tell a story about someone you've never met, never knew, don't know anything about, and then you're just like, maybe I'll put a person of color in this book because it seems to be what is of interest to publishers these days. You got to check a lot of boxes, in my humble opinion, before you go there. And if you go there and it's a truth that you're looking to tell, I'm going to support that. But I'm also going to question, I need to know, I need to understand a little bit. And I do also feel that over time, the playing field will level out. But right now, authors of color, diverse stories being told, we've been held back for a long time. So let us through. Let us just go through for a while. And don't be mad. There's plenty of pie.
And there's plenty of stories.
Plenty of stories, yeah.
Yes,
I agree with Denny that I think, this is the time for people to tell their own stories and for the space to be made for people to tell their own stories. The new project I'm working on, my two main characters are Latinx. Like, one is a man who can pass as white. And so I'm getting into a lot of the things I've experienced in my lived experience. And you just can't bring those things to the same level, I think, unless it's something you've grappled with perhaps for your life. And that's not to say it can't be done, but I think there's such value in letting people tell their own stories, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, personal essay, whatever, from their lived experience. But a piece of advice I've given to authors I've mentored for writing characters where they might not share some characteristics, especially if the author is a white person. If you're writing a character who you decide to have be a person of a different race or ethnicity or sexuality or gender or anything, if you can take that person and make that character white and nothing about their story changes, you just wrote a white character and then put something else on top of them.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good test if you're trying to do this. Like, people will have different challenges, different reactions to them, different things they face, different friend groups, and like all the different things that you might not even realize. But if you take your character and you just turn them into like a white man and nothing changes for them, like, think about what you're doing with your storytelling, because that's a pretty glaring litmus test that there's some work there that needs to be done.
The book I like to cite in this context is one of my favorite books the last 2 years was by Rebecca Makkai. It's called The Great Believers. Is that the name of it? And it's set in, half of it's set in Chicago among the gay community in the late 80s. And Rebecca Makkai is obviously not of that community. And I was thinking, gosh, if I had said, no, you can't write about that, those weren't your people, then I wouldn't have been able to read this truly amazing book. And she did exactly what Denny talked about. She did the research and she clearly talked to people. And I just felt like this woman, this woman really got it. She did, she did the work. And then she did what we all do, which is the imaginative, the empathetic leap to understand these people. And I thought she did such an exceptional job that, it made me realize that it can be done, but for the reasons that Denny and all of us have been talking about, that it requires, real care and diligence. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's actually, as I was listening to you all, I was realizing this is another great example of how contemporary historical fiction is, that no matter what, the author is still importing their lived experience into the past. And it does require a lot of empathetic work in addition to a lot of research. And if you're looking to tell a story that is not only historically, temporally separated from your lived experience, but in any other category separated from yours, I think it's a really good idea to ask, why is it that I want to tell this story? If it's just because you think like diversity is the new cool thing, like, maybe that's not enough to get you there. But, maybe there are other reasons. But personally, I think that making space, if you're not of a marginalized background, making space for writers who are is probably pretty important right now and always. So Carlene asks us how, and I love this question too, although I don't know the movie, she wants to know how we think about something like what was done with a twist on history in the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood movie. I haven't seen that movie, I'm clueless, but in general, I think the question is, sort of how do you feel about fiction changing aspects of history? Has anyone seen that movie?
I have. Can we talk about it without this? We'd have to do a spoiler to really talk about this movie.
I don't care if you spoil it, but everybody, I
haven't
earmuffs
seen it,
if you don't want to hear the spoiler.
Well, I'll just say, then I'll speak very generically. What he does is he brings a major historical twist at the very end of the movie. So, and involves the Mansons. So something different occurs than what initially happened, and it's done in a very bloody Tarantino way. So I have a lot of issues with the violence, but I don't have an issue with coming up with a new historical outcome, because it was, it made the movie kind of more interesting for me that he did.
Oh, so the ending made it more interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't watched it yet. I've been on deadline for this thing. But I'll have to check it out. I like it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I like the twist.
Yeah.
Yeah. So generally, how do you feel about twists on history? Is there a threshold for like, whoa, major historical event, that's too far, minor historical event, that's okay?
I think it's with this Hollywood movie, because I have seen previews, I think it's a retelling. It's not really, it's telling you up front in the previews that something was different in Hollywood in the 1950s or 1960s or whenever it takes place, because it's just different. I'll give, without giving anything away.
Yeah.
But and I don't think that's a historical, that's a different type of historical fiction work that falls under one of the subgenres. I guess you can't, it's sort of like one of my favorite shows now is called Flash on the CW. And he plays a lot with time travel. And there are fixed moments in time that you can't touch, or else you mess up everything that happens after that. So you have a choice, as I think as a historical fiction author, you have to have those columns in place that are historically accurate, if that's the story you want to tell. Now, if you want to do something like the Hollywood film and put a little twist into it that tells you why your history as an author or screenwriter is different, then go for it. But it's still a different genre.
So folks, we are getting to the end of our hour, to my great disappointment. I'm going to really quickly answer Pamela's next question, because I think we can delineate this, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time left for the last one. So Pamela wants to know, what's the difference between historical fiction and historical fantasy? Like any genre, the key, I think, is probably in the noun. So historical fiction is a fictional story that primarily uses history as a narrative element. Historical fantasy is a magical story, because that's what fantasy means, with a historical element. And then we've also spoken about alternative history, which is the historical story that takes one of those big pillars that Jenny was just talking about and yanks them out and does something different. So hopefully that helps. Pamela, if you have any questions, ask us on Twitter, perhaps. And then, so Aisha wants to know if anyone has ever found, after publishing a novel, research that presented something that countered your representation of the character. And just a reminder, we've only got about 2 minutes left.
I went to the National Book Festival last year, and I think it was Philippia Gregory was asked the same question, and she said she found something, a reader corrected her, and the reader was right. And because she is Philippia Gregory, in the next run of her book, she corrected it. But she acknowledged it. Well, I'm not Philippia. So there was, chances are, if I have made a mistake, I will, in something that is concrete in one of those columns, hopefully not. My copy editors worked really hard. I will definitely,
if it's, I would add, if it's a meaningful change. I mean, I get letters all the time from, there weren't any mockingbirds in the Hudson River Valley in 1830. It's like, I don't care. I don't care. There's a mockingbird now. Like, yeah.
I think that's the benefit of doing a lot of in-depth research for me, is I want to know personally that I have the facts down. And then if I extrapolate and I make things up, I do have that factual foundation. And that's really important to me, because the story I'm creating is fictional, but I don't like to make up historical facts. And that's really where my kind of geekery comes out, for wanting to research a ton and go through archives and see everything. And that might be my second round or third round of research even, but I do want to sort of be armed with those facts, so that I do have the bones right of the time and place, because it's not historical fantasy. So for me, it is important that I have a really good factual foundation from which I can sort of build on. But
I think there's a difference between a mistake and a manipulation. We've talked about manipulations already everybody makes mistakes. I don't see a problem with it, except that it runs the risk every time you make a mistake of pulling the reader out of the fictional dream.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's the only reason why I think we're concerned about it. We don't want someone to say, there are no mockingbirds, I'm throwing this book away. Most of us aren't going to care either, like Lou. You know, if maybe he lost that one reader, I don't know.
Yeah,
but, you know, like you can't account for everybody. But hopefully, though, the manipulations, at least I like to try to fess up to those at the end in the author's notes. Say, like, these are the things I've changed. You know, there are smaller things I changed that I don't put in there that I'm happy to talk about if anybody wanted to as a reader. But so I think we have now run up against our time limit. This has been a lovely conversation. Thank you so very much, all of you, for participating. Thank you, audience, for your fantastic questions. You made this even more fun. I really appreciate the engagement. Just one final administrative note. Of course, again, all books are available via Potter's House, and 1455 has put together this fantastic conference for free for everybody, but it's not free to produce. They have to pay for things like the Zoom platform and things like that. So if you are willing and able, they would love your donations, and you can go to 1455arts.org. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Bye.